Hey, welcome to part 5 of Deploy a Python web application on Linode from scratch. Now, if you haven't done parts 1 through 4, check the links in the description so you actually go through all those. They are pretty important to get to this point. But what we're going to be doing now is using Nginx to actually have our Python web application exposed to the world. After we figure out the configuration for that, then we're going to use Supervisor or Supervisor D to actually run that Python web application on its own in the background and restarting when it's necessary. And then we're going to cap it off with actually deploying code and making changes and then solving the inevitable issues that happen when it comes to deploying your code continuously. So it's actually a really important video in this entire series. It's kind of like the capstone video, if you will, because what you're going to be doing coming out of this is then you'll be able to improve your web application code as much as possible. So be sure to let me know in the comments if there's things that you want to see us add onto this series so that we know for sure. And also be sure to subscribe and like and share all this if you've learned something of value out of it. But before we do anything else, let's go ahead and actually jump in and get started with Nginx. All right, so what we need to do now is we need to change that static web page on our Linode server. We want that to change over to our Python web application. In this case, it's a fast API application. And the way we're going to do that is by using Nginx. We're going to actually configure Nginx to essentially listen or run this local host, but all in the server, of course. And we're going to do that without having to change the port. Like the default port will still work. So that port of 8000 should still work behind the configuration of Nginx. But I want to give the important caveat about Nginx is that you don't actually have to have a web server running at all for Nginx to work. In other words, we don't need a Python web application for Nginx to work. We don't need a Ruby on Rails application. We don't need a PHP application. We don't need a lot of things for Nginx to work. At the fundamental level, we just need a static page, like a HTML page, like we see here. So what we do here is really just about configuring Nginx pretty much one time. I mean, you might have to configure it more later, especially if you want to add different features like security features like HTTPS and all that. But the general idea is we're going to be changing Nginx just slightly so that it displays this content instead of this content. And of course, we already have our application on the server itself, but we don't have it running in a way that will allow Nginx to work. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump back into my code. I'm going to make a new folder called Nginx. And inside of here, I'm going to just call this myapp.conf. So using .conf is actually great for Nginx, but what we're doing here is just scratching the surface of what Nginx can do just to get our minimal application running and correctly. So first and foremost, we could totally look on our current Nginx configuration. So if we go into the root, for example, we can go into cd/edc/nginx, and we can see all sorts of things that are in here. The ones that are critical or important to us are the sites available and the sites enabled. This is what we'll be working off of. So if I actually cd into sites enabled, I can see that there is a default in there. And if I do cat default, I'll see all sorts of configuration that's, well, mostly commented out, as you see here. But what we also see is things that aren't commented out, like the root here and some other configuration. So we're going to be doing something very similar to this, but I'm actually going to be changing it ever so slightly. So if you need a reference, this is why I showed you this. This is just a reference to make it a little bit easier for you. So let's go back down here and let's go ahead and write out our first configuration. And it's just server with the curly brackets just like this. And now what we want to do is put it listening to a specific port. So if we do listen 80, so 80 and a colon there, or semicolon rather, is the actual port for pretty much every insecure website. So if we did port 443, that's typically the HTTPS websites. but we aren't going to get too advanced here. Of course, if you want to see those things, let me know in the comments so we can do this again. But the general idea is we want to listen to that port. So Nginx will know to listen to that port. And if we actually look inside of our configuration currently, it is listening to that port. It does have this other part here. We don't have to worry about that right now. But generally, idea is it is listening to that port. And we can also have it listen to 443 as well. So we can have it listen to both ports at the same time, which is really, really nice. Next, what we've got is the root showing up. This is actually something we don't necessarily need, but it is nice to have. So this is the root folder to where your HTML might live. So in our case, we have it in just standard HTML. But the reason that we have this is that I can then add in other HTML pages in here, and Nginx can still serve those. It can actually still display those even in conjunction with what we're about to do. So that's almost the fundamental part of this. In many cases, you'll also see a server name. So server name, and then you give it something. In my case, I'm just going to give it the name of localhost. That is totally acceptable, even in production for this. You can give it a different server name, such as www.myapp.com, or whatever that would end up being. That's probably a little bit better in the long run. But for now, we're just going to leave it in as localhost. And realistically, this is essentially how our current configuration is working. The server name, as you see, there's an underscore here, so it doesn't even matter. It also does have an index file in this case, right? So this is actually where our index.nginx-debian.html is actually running. So inside that HTML, that's where that configuration is. But you also notice that there's index.html, index.htm. And that's just saying, hey, if you have that index.html inside of that folder, or really inside of this folder, then it would actually render that as well. But what we want to do is actually change the location. So location slash, if in here I actually send what's called a proxy pass, which essentially is saying, hey, look for some sort of web application on here, or look for some other serving process, that's what we're going to end up doing. Okay, so let me close that out so it's not too confusing. So the idea here is we want to set up location slash and then curly brackets. Now, this is going to match all locations that are sent to this. So in other words, if we actually go to Chrome and do ABC or anything else, right? All of these will then be sent to the configuration I set up here. Now, of course, if I set it as ABC, then it's going to be anything from ABC and everything else, including just ABC. So, of course, that's not what I want. I want it to catch everything so that Nginx is just really forwarding this on to my web application, to my fast API web application. And to do this, it takes a couple different parameters that I'm just going to go ahead and throw in here, and I'll explain what they are. Okay, so the first one, this proxy pass, this means that we want to send it to some sort of proxy upstream server. We'll do that configuration in a minute. The throwing around proxy or the name of proxy, just think of it like hey, we're going to be forwarding on information here. So every time Nginx is like, hey, somebody went to this web page, let me just forward that on to my eventual web application, which we'll set up in just a moment. And this is true for the headers as well. So it's also going to be forwarding things related to the headers, and it's not going to do a standard redirect because there is a way to redirect things. To me, this is like all this configuration that you probably don't need to know about just yet. If you already know what these things are, then yeah, you can dive in deeper, and by all means, dive in deeper if you want. But if you're just a beginner, it's just a good idea to set these things, especially at the very least, these two configurations, but we can have all of them. Okay, cool. So now that we've got that, we actually have to set up what's called an upstream proxy, an upstream server that will actually denote our local host. This is also pretty easy. So we set up upstream, and then this name, whatever we name this right here. In my case, I put it in as my proxy. So I'm going to leave it in as my proxy. So you could call it, CFE proxy. You could call it my fast API proxy, whatever you want to call it. Just make sure that whatever you name this is the same as this. And you're always going to use HTTP in here, even if you're listening to a different port like the secure port. Okay, so there we go. And now we will do curly brackets. And this is where we just declare server of local host and 8000. Okay, so hopefully this looks a little familiar to you in the sense that if we went on our local computer where my app is currently running, I can actually go to localhost of 8000. Now your server is actually going to work very similar to that. It's going to look for that local host and a port of 8000 running. So we're going to have to verify that that's actually running. So this is actually our minimal configuration for Nginx to have it connected to something that's running on port 8000, really a web server that's running on port 8000. Now, of course, we need to really do a lot of configuration there, or well, some configuration there to ensure that that's running often and using a production ready version. But for now, we'll just stick with the Nginx stuff to see if we can even get this portion working. Okay, cool. So now that we've got that, let's go back into our local host here. I'm going to close this out and do git status. What I should see is that Nginx being coming in. So we'll do git add -- all and git commit and added custom Nginx config. And then we'll do git push linode main. And there we go. Okay, cool. So pushed, everything's looking good. And so now what we have to reiterate here is I didn't actually change any configuration yet. I just added this file. And since we don't have to change Nginx very much, I'm actually not going to have it automatically change things on the server. In other words, my git post receive hook does not need to automatically update Nginx. You can do it that way, but I actually do not recommend that you do. I think you should just go manually, especially if you're learning. Okay, so the part of this that we need to use is we actually need to update this on our root user. So if we see our root user, this is actually a good place to do it, is using our root user, because this is sort of a root process that's always going to be running. Now, we totally could have it in our other user, our custom user that's going to be running our application, but I actually like doing it in our root user because it's going to be running off of the local host and really just listening for things. Otherwise, we're going to have to change a bunch of permissions. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to link my myapp.conf to this folder right here. So of course, what that means, we need to go into cd var www, and we should see that Nginx file there. And sure enough, it is. So if I do pwd, I'm inside of this folder, and we want it to go here. So to do this, we're going to create, actually, I'm going to go ahead and copy it first. So I'm going to copy it into sites available, and then I will enable it shortly after. So we're going to go ahead and copy from var www nginx and then myapp.conf. And again, we definitely want to have .conf in here, and we want to copy this into this folder right here. Okay, so CP stands for copy, and we're going to put it into that folder. And now if I change into that folder, I should see it in there. And sure enough, I do. So now what I need to do, now that it's in sites available, I need to put it into sites enabled. This is definitely confusing from time to time, but basically, hey, what's available and what is actually enabled. So let's go ahead and take a look at that one. We'll cd back in and go and do sites enabled. And there we go. So we only have default in here. So I'm going to go ahead and remove default. And now I have nothing enabled. So if I go back into my app and try to refresh in here, it's still showing it up, even though I technically disabled it. Now, if I actually rebooted my system, it would no longer show up. But there's an easier way to make sure that that's the case, or to make sure that Nginx knows that something changed. So to let our system know that something changed, there's two commands that we can potentially use. Now, the first command is one that you'll use fairly often if you make minor changes to Nginx, which is sudo systemctl reload Nginx. So reload allows us to keep Nginx running and not actually stop it. So you could actually do stop and then start. Reload is just going to potentially reload it. And if I refresh in here, now that page is no longer showing. And that's because, of course, our sites enabled have nothing. Now, sites enabled is not sites available. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and link our configuration from sites available into sites enabled. So let's go ahead and cd back into sites and available. And we should see our configuration in there, and of course it is. Now, one of the things you might be tempted to do is just do ln-s myapp.conf and then // sites enabled. And technically that would probably work, but you're going to have some issues. So when in doubt, use the absolute path to both of these things. So in this case, it's ln-s and then this entire path. And of course, lowercase s, do not use uppercase s. We do not need a hard link here. And we'll go ahead and do myapp.conf. And then we'll go ahead and do that same thing, but instead of sites available, it's sites enabled. And we can say myapp.conf. And so what's happening here is this is going to be what's called a soft link. This is the source, and this is the destination. And since it's a soft link, that means that whatever I do to this file is also going to be updated in this location. This is not actually a file itself, it's just pointing to this file, but Nginx knows the difference between the two. And so now I can hit enter, and what I should be able to do now is actually reload Nginx again. So sudo system ctl reload Nginx and hit enter. Now, if I had errors here, the errors are probably related to a couple things. One of them being I didn't do Nginx correctly. Like I didn't put semicolons everywhere. I didn't put the correct curly brackets and all that. So if that did happen to you, definitely take a look at the code that we have on GitHub, which is linked in the description, or take a look at the actual default option that we have inside of sites available. So at this point, we could actually enable sites available too, so the default, the one that used to be there, or we could just leave the one that we currently have, which we can verify inside of sites enabled right here, and it's just that single one. We can have more than one there, but I don't recommend it at this point. So now if we look at our actual project, it now gives us a 502 bad gateway. So this is actually a good sign. This is showing me that Nginx is working. It just doesn't really know about our local host here. So the last part of this is actually just to test that our local host actually works. And I'm not going to do it inside of the root user. Instead, I want to use my other user that I've been using for all this, which is my CFE user. And this is actually the user I want to test this with. So to make things easy for us, we'll just go ahead and activate the virtual environment. And that is in var www, and of course in app. And we'll go ahead and do bin/activate, so /bin/activate, and then we'll go ahead and run that uviacorn again. So uviacorn, and we'll do main:app, and you could do -- reload if you like. This is not how we're going to do it in the long run, but I'm going to go ahead and hit enter, and I'm going to notice one caveat to how things are set up right here, and that's that it is on 127.0.0.1 and a port of 8000, whereas our configuration says localhost 8000. So if I go into my gateway server right now, it's showing up and it is working. But the problem is, of course, if I hit Control-C and close out that process, it's not working again, right? And this is on our live actual server. So certainly I can run this manually and leave it like that, but as soon as I leave my SSH session, this will cease to run. It will literally cancel out for me. And we can verify that by literally canceling out our SSH session. And again, it's still showing me bad gateway. So to solve this, we need one more technology. And we also want to move away from using uviacorn, as well as the standard actual host, which was that 127 stuff. We want to move away from that as well. It's not something we need to do just yet. Instead, what we need to do now is install and use something called Supervisor, so our actual local host, so our fast API app ends up running all the time. So let's go ahead and do that now. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to implement gunicorn with uviacorn on Supervisor. And I'll explain all of those things as we go. But the first thing is, let's go ahead and open up a new file here. And I just want to write out a standard gunicorn command. And that's gunicorn. And then we do something like wsgi:\app. And then we might bind it to a specific host and port. So if we do bind 0.0.0, that's the host that we would bind it to. This is also known as localhost. And then 8000. Okay, cool. So that is a really standard way to do it, and it's actually probably WSGI. This is something I would use on Django, for example. And in Django, it's probably even just application, not even app. But of course, we're not using Django here. We're using Fast API. So what I want to do is just say main:app. And this is almost the root command that we need for gunicorn to work with uviacorn in production. But unfortunately, we're missing one piece, and that is uvacorn. And it's really simple. It's just -k, and then it's uvacorn.workers.uvacorn_worker. All right. So this is the basic configuration or the basic command that I want to have my current app running on localhost at port 8000. And of course, this actually corresponds to the port that we have for Nginx as well. So let's actually try this one out. And I'm going to go ahead and copy this command. And I'm already in my user, my Linode user on the production server. And we'll go ahead and cd into our application. So it's var www and app. And then I'll go ahead and activate it with bin activate. And then we'll just put that command in there, hit enter, and run it. And there we go. So with that running, I can actually go into Nginx. And now I see that it is running, or at least on my Linode server, it's totally running, which is great. So now that we've got this, how do we actually shut this down? Or in other words, how would I actually take down Gunicorn with another process? Now, the idea here is when I make changes to my code, I'm going to need to restart this server somehow, right? So right now it's in the foreground. It's not in the background. It's a foreground service. So if I hit Control-C and then run it again, or run that same command again with copy and paste here, it's going to run it again and it would refresh all the code. But unfortunately, we're not going to be able to do Control-C in this environment. It's like we can't do that in production. We have to do it a little bit differently. And to do that, it's really simple. I have another SSH session going with this same user. So just 2 sessions right now. And the command is pkill -HUP gunicorn. And what this is doing is it's actually sending a signal to all instances of gunicorn to shut down gracefully. We hit enter, and that will actually shut it down gracefully. Okay, and so what's going to happen here is it might take a minute or so for it to actually shut down, but we should see that we got a signal here, right? And what actually ended up happening is it did shut down, but I believe it actually started right back up, given how gunicorn can work in some instances. So it didn't just kill it altogether. We can stop it altogether by doing pkill and gunicorn, and what that should actually do is stop it altogether, as we see here. Right, so it didn't really do a soft boot. That was a hard shutdown. And so using that different command of -HUP should actually give us a flushed new version of gunicorn with it running. And of course, if I try to run it, try to do that same command right now, and I can't press up there, I have to actually type it out. So if I do that, it won't show errors or anything like that. It's just the process is simply not running. Okay, so why am I showing you this? Well, the idea is we want this to run in the background. So if it's running in the background, we need a way to restart it, right? It's not like what I just did where I had it running with gunicorn like this, right? So I'm controlling all that. Now what I want to have happen is have Supervisor control all of that. So let's go ahead and actually start the Supervisor process. So inside of my local code, I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder called Supervisor. And in here, we'll make our Supervisor configuration. I'll go ahead and call it myapp.supervisor.conf. The only important part of this file name is .conf. The other ones could be named however you'd like once we put it in the correct destination. And we are going to be using the root user for this one. Okay, so what is it that we're trying to do here? Well, again, we want to run the command that I just put forth, which was gunicorn and then uvacorn into our main app, binded to the host of 000 and 8000. This part is critical. You could try it without it, but it's probably not going to work. Okay, so that's going to be the command. So we do command equals, and I'm kind of working backwards here, but then the next thing is going to be where do I want this to happen, which is the directory of, well, var www app. Now, of course, this means that its Supervisor is going to change into this folder and then run this command. Now, some of you might be like, wait a minute, this is probably not the best way to write out gunicorn in this like, you know, one-off copy paste situation, because what we did here was we actually activated that virtual environment. So of course, another way to actually get to that gunicorn is to use bin, these, slash bin slash unicorn, and that is an absolute path to the gunicorn that's installed in that virtual environment. As we sort of have discussed before, maybe not for gunicorn, but now this can be run virtually anywhere. The only difference would be to actually add the absolute path to the main file right there. That's literally the only difference, but I don't want to do that because we have this working directory. This should work just fine. The next thing is the actual user that's going to be executing this is going to be our CFE user. No surprise here, they have the permissions to run this stuff based on what we did a long time ago. So that user is the one that we want to use here. And then finally, I'm going to give this a program name, and this is going to be equal to my app. Okay, so square brackets program : my app. This is all the supervisor commands and all set up for supervisor. Next, we're going to go ahead and say auto start being true, and then auto restart being true as well. And so that is if the entire system reboots, as in your Linode server, if that reboots, then we can auto start it. And if for some reason the app ends, this will auto restart. This actually will play nicely with this kill gunicorn. So this will actually make sure that it should restart, as we'll see and test in just a little bit. Next, what we want is a couple log files. So there's the std out log file, and then the std error log file. So two different kinds of log files that Python uses, Python web applications use. Actually, a lot of web applications use them. And so where we want to put them is, if you remember, we had a www-logs, and so I'll just do myapp.stdout.log. And this is just a text file, so it doesn't have to be .log, but that's typically what happens. And then std error is like an error file, but it's not always like this is an error. Sometimes it's other things in there as well. Okay, so this is our configuration. Now, I think it should all make sense at this point. We're using CFE user, we're going inside of this app, we're running this command, we restart and start things, and here are the log files that are going to be associated to this project by default, which is great. So now that we've got that, let's go ahead and add it. Going back into my local shell, I'll do git status, git add -- all, git commit, and added supervisor config, and then git push origin or Linode rather main. Okay, and now back into our root user. I'm going to go ahead and cd into var www just to verify. Oops, let's put the right www. And we just verify supervisor is in there. So cd supervisor, and there's the configuration. Everything's looking good. Okay, so now we'll go ahead and install supervisor. First, we'll do sudo apt update, and then we will do sudo apt install supervisor, and we'll just go ahead and say -y to accept. And so supervisor will take a moment to install. Once it does, it's going to be one more step, which is actually starting supervisor. So we'll do sudo service supervisor start. And so worst case scenario, you will have to run this again if you reboot, but it should actually stay booted from here on out for supervisor. It's sort of a middleman that's going to manage all kinds of programs that you want it to manage. So like if you were going to implement something like Celery, if you're familiar with what Celery is with Python and task queues, you can also use supervisor for that in tandem with what we're about to do. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and do sudo and then supervisor, and this is going to be CTL as in supervisor control, and we'll go ahead and do status, and we get no errors or nothing going on so far. And of course, the goal is to change that. Now, right now we're inside of the absolute path to our configuration. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to copy this configuration to the supervisor configuration. Now, the reason I'm not doing a symbolic link or a soft link to this file is because I don't want to accidentally mess up the supervisor configuration and then bring down my whole site on any given git push. So something like this, very similar to Nginx, is I just want to copy it over and change it when I absolutely need to change it. And of course, we're going to test some things to make sure it's working. But the idea is just not accidentally making mistakes and setting ourselves up for ultimate failure with this. Okay, so how do we actually set this configuration up? Now, that's in cd/etc/supervisor. That, of course, is now the supervisor configuration folder. And notice that we have 2 in here. If I actually copy this and do cat supervisor.conf, it actually gives me a sample supervisor file. There's not a whole lot to this one, but it does give you a sample one, which is kind of nice. Okay, so again, we list everything out. If I cd into conf.d, this is actually a folder. This is where we want to bring our file in. Okay, so where is our file again? Now, it should be in, if we do cp and var www supervisor/myapp.supervisor.conf, and then we just bring it into here. I'm already inside of that folder, so I can actually just put the file name in there, and it should copy it right there. Okay, so we can cat and copy it again, and sure enough, there it is. Okay, so now are the commands that you're probably going to want to remember. First off is sudo supervisor ctl reread. You want to do reread anytime you change any of the files inside of the supervisor configuration folder, and then sudo supervisor ctl update. So that's going to update those processes and potentially run them depending on how you have it configured. So we do sudo supervisor and ctl status. We hit enter and notice that it already has our app running, and it's been running for 11 seconds. So let's actually take a look. And of course, in my actual production IP address, there it is. It's running. How cool is that? So that's really, really nice. So now we just need to configure one more thing, and then we're pretty much ready to make a bunch of changes to this. And that's what we'll do after this. But before I make any changes, to the code itself, let's actually make one change to a critical piece related to the code. And if you think about it, what is a critical piece that's related to the code? And that's Git and our version control system. So what we want to do here is go into var and then cd www git, and then we're going to go ahead and do cd hello linode fast api.git, and then we're going to go into our hooks, and then we're going to go ahead and do nano post receive, and this is where we want to run that pkill command. So after we check out everything, that means the code has changed. That means we want gunicorn to restart gracefully. So we'll do pkill-hup gunicorn. Now, actually, before I even do -hup, I'm just going to do pkill gunicorn so you can see what happens with that. And let's just verify that it has changed. Sure enough, it has. There it is. Okay, so now I'm going to keep root up. And I don't necessarily need to go into my other SSH sessions, but rather my local session and actually make changes to our app itself. So now I'm going to go ahead and say, hello world, this is supervisor. Save that. We'll go ahead and do git status. We're going to add this one, git commit, and let's say updated for supervisor and gunicorn. And then we'll go ahead and do git push linode main. Okay, really quickly, while that happens, we refresh in here. Notice it's actually already back up. So it actually is working for us. Now, this is because of several things. One of them is supervisor does automatically restart for us. However, the thing that I shouldn't have done was pkill gunicorn, because it will actually have some downtime, right? So if I pkill it again, hit enter, refresh in here, notice there is downtime, right? And so it's going to come back up, but it might take a minute, might take longer than that. And it also might just not come up in the way that we expect. And there it is. It took maybe 30 seconds, maybe longer. And of course, that's what we want to avoid. We don't want 30 seconds worth going through here. So it's pkill-hup, and then control save, or control C to exit out, Y to save, and then enter to get out of there, as you probably know by now. So that signal is now just slightly different. And so if we actually try that out on root or on the actual user that's going to be executing that signal, which is our CFE user, right? So if we look in here, our CFE user, pkill-hup gunicorn, hit enter, and that's actually going to do that. It's hard to tell what's happening with this. So another way to tell is by using LSOV or ls of or list of -i colon 8000. So this is looking at the port of 8000 for the different processes that are running. Notice that 2 instances of gunicorn are working. So if I do pkill again, and then the list of that 8000 again, I should see different processes running in the near future for both of them. Maybe at first it'll just be one of them, but it will take some time before they actually both refresh altogether. And then if we did pkill the entire thing, then it would be completely different processes as well. So yeah, that's actually pretty cool. This is now a fully working web application in production with background services and all this really good stuff. So one more thing that we want to do is just really render out an HTML page here and kind of see like how we would approach making changes to our web application going forward. All right, so now what we're going to do is actually render out that original Nginx file, but now through FastAPI and Jinja 2. Now this is really just to show you how you are going to be working with this code going forward, assuming that you aren't needing to change any of the default configuration. As in, if you need to install additional requirements, this isn't going to necessarily do that. But it will allow us to actually change some code and see those changes in real time, or at least on our server. Okay, so first and foremost, let's go ahead and jump into main.py. And I'm going to import a couple things here. So we're going to import pathlib. And then I already did in my requirements, I already had Jinja 2 in there. So I'm just going to assume that you do as well. Next, I'm going to go ahead and do from fastapi.responses. We're going to import a class called the HTML response. And then we're going to go ahead and do from fastapi.templating. We're going to import the Jinja 2 templates. And the first thing I want to do is declare my base directory being equal to the same location as the app folder itself. And to do this, we use pathlib. So the file path to main.py is this right here. That's a way to get that file path using pathlib. And then if you do .parent, that will give me the folder of this current file, which will be app. And then if I did .parent again, that would actually give me the folder of my entire project here right next to, or the folder that actually holds app, HTML, Nginx, and so on. And so that's actually how I'm going to be using the templates themselves. So the template dir is going to be related to this base dir, and that is going to be the parent. This is actually going to be maybe my root project dir, and then from there I can do template dir being my root project dir / templates, or in this case I have HTML is the folder that I'll use, and so I'm going to do HTML. Okay, so this template directory, this is just a relative path to this template directory. Now, this is going to work on my local machine as well as my production machine, which is why I'm using pathlib. If I had any doubts whatsoever, I can use absolute paths, but they might not work on the different systems, right? So it probably won't actually, which is why you use something like pathlib within Python. That, of course, is different than when we use something like Supervisor or even Nginx. Having absolute paths is important because those only are used on our production server in this case. Okay, so with that out of the way, we now have a templates directory. So underneath app, we're going to go ahead and declare templates, and we're going to set this equal to the Jinja 2 templates class. And we're going to pass in the directory being the string of this template dir. Now, a lot of times the pathlib itself can be passed into arguments like this, but when in doubt, just put the string and that will give me the absolute path, which should actually equate to, on our production server, var and HTML. That's essentially what should happen with this template directory. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is change this home page to just render out that original HTML file right here. And it's actually really easy. So we take this templates here, we get rid of the dictionary that it returns. Instead, it's going to be templates.template response. And now we actually put in the template path. So this could be a relative path to the HTML folder, right? So I'll go ahead and just do index.nginx-debian.html. And then we also want to pass in a empty dictionary in here. This is called a context dictionary, which I'll do in a moment. And then the next thing is I just want to change the actual response, and we'll just say response class equals to that HTML response. This is basically telling Fast API that you should return back with just an HTML document, which is what is happening here. Okay, cool. So now I've made some changes to my project. So let's go ahead and test it locally first. So again, uv-acorn and main:\app. We can hit enter, and that should just give me that, right? And if I open this up, what I might see is something like this, right? So I've got an internal server error, and then I have context must include a request key. Now, that's an error that's related to Jinja as well as Fast API. And so this is where you're going to want to test things most of the time, right? Not in production, but on your local machine, which is exactly why I wanted this error to show up. That being said, every once in a while, you are going to have this as a problem. You are going to mess up here. So I'm going to go ahead and close that out and say git status and git add, git commit, and we'll go ahead and say updated main for HTML templates. And then we'll go ahead and do git push origin main. Oops, not origin, but rather Linode main. Okay, so I pushed it and it went into production. And if we go and look at our server now, we've got internal server error. Oh no, what do? Right? There's a few different ways on how we could actually handle this. First off, we could do git log. And instead of using this right here, I can actually go back a commit and force that to work, right? So really quickly, let's copy main.py just for a moment, paste it into just an empty file, and I'm going to go ahead and reset it. I'm going to copy this and go git reset to that commit --hard, and then git push linode and main. It's going to give me a failure here, so I can force it, and what that will do, or what that should do, is actually bring me back one commit. Okay, now do keep in mind that what I just did is probably not the best way to solve every problem, but it is a way to know about if a problem like what we just saw came up. But I want to bring that problem back. And when I did the reset of hard, it actually got rid of everything. So I just brought it back in, saved it, and we're still going to keep that problem. I do want to solve it in a different way. So I'll go ahead and do git add --all, git commit, and updated main, and then git push linode main. Of course, the main branch, not the main file. And again, internal server error. Okay, so how do we actually solve or find out what this server error is? Well, one of the ways would be to actually log in as our CFE user and navigate into var ww logs and take a look at our different logs here. So we can look at the standard error logs as we see here. This is giving me that same error that we saw locally. And then we can also try our other logs as well. So let's go ahead and list this out again. So we can look at both of these logs. And the std error obviously has the actual log for us. But this required me to actually SSH in there. So is there another way I can actually go about doing that? Well, of course, you don't actually have to SSH and navigate in. Instead, what you can do is var ww log, and then, or logs rather, and then the actual log itself right there. You can actually put a string in here just like this, and then we can put cat like that, and that actually will open up that file for us. So that's just a simple and quick way to do that, to actually look at the logs for our user and that IP address, so we can see that it says context must include a request key. And you know, there's an art to identifying problems with some code, but it also does, especially with Python applications, I think it does a really good job of telling you where the error occurs, which is this right here. And really, you want to look for something that you recognize. But again, there's a little bit of an art and a science, and also just experience having a bunch of different errors. So anyways, I've found that this is what the error is. And how I solve this often is by copying this error, doing a quick search, and I get this right here, and it gives me Jinja templates. Right, so right off the bat, it's giving me templates, and it looks like it's related to what it is that I'm trying to do. So if I scroll down a bit, I'll probably find what the error is. And sure enough, this actually really looks like the code that I'm working on. So let's go ahead and go back in here, and let's go off of what they're saying. So what I saw in there was request and request and request. Okay, so I already know that this is potentially going to work, but the idea is context must include a request key. So inside of Jinja templates, this is very similar to Django templates, but the idea is that we pass in context to the template. So that request context actually does come in here, so we can actually use this as context. Now to make it simple, we can actually just change it to, like, let's say title, and I'll just go ahead and say hello world from Jinja. Okay, and so I can use this key value pair inside of this template, and I can get rid of this instead and use curly brackets, 2 curly brackets, and then title, and that should actually render out that context. Okay, so let's go ahead and try this locally again. I'm going to try and run it locally inside of my app. We'll press up a few times and run uviacorn. It's somewhere in here. There it is. And there we go. So it's running. And let's go ahead and look at localhost, refresh. And well, now it's got message field required. So it's giving me another kind of error potentially that's going on in here. So let's go ahead and, so this is now saying query request field required. It's missing. Okay, so what's going on with that? Well, remember what I did is I just passed in this request argument here. Now, depending on what application or code that you're using, as in not Fast API, this might actually work. But unfortunately, it doesn't work for Fast API and Jinja. So let's go back into our code, and we see that this is not working. So let's go ahead and say pass request Jinja to Fast API. Okay, so what we see here, Fast API is giving me templates, and if I scroll down a bit, what I should also see is we have this right here. So it's actually giving us another aspect, another argument that I have to bring in, because even if you don't know Fast API, you see that the argument is of a certain type. So let's go ahead and do that. Up here is going to be request, and then down here in our request, we want to set it equal to that certain type of request. Save that. And so now I think we should be okay as far as how this ends up working. So let's go ahead and save it, and we'll refresh on our local host. And let's see, let's refresh the whole thing. I don't have reload going, otherwise it probably would have worked. And now it's giving me template was not found. Okay, so clearly something's wrong with my template directory here on how I set that up. So let's go ahead and check out what that might be just by printing it out. And let's run that again. And so we see that it just says HTML. Okay, so that's not great. It's not actually resolving where I want it to be. So what I want to do here is I want to actually hit .resolve, save that, and that should actually give me the correct location. And sure enough, there it is. Okay, so a lot of different things that could happen here. And as you see, we can get really complicated with just trying to solve problems from time to time. But now we're at a point where we can actually do so. Like we can literally, now we've made all these changes, we can now do git status, git add -- all, git commit, and say updated index page, and then git push Linode main. Now we solve that problem, and we come back in here, and there it is. It's now actually working correctly and showing us the exact code that we needed it to show. And then if we wanted to look at the logs again, we can still look at the logs. The std error is actually giving me every log, right? So it's actually showing me that it is working. Everything's working well, and it also terminated due to that signal, right? So it received that signal, everything that we wanted to see. So it actually rebooted everything as well. So that's, I think, pretty awesome. Now, I realize like how I solved these errors might have been incredibly fast for some of you, or incredibly slow for some of you. So solving errors is something I've gotten very, very comfortable and familiar with. So it does take some time before you do. But I absolutely wanted you to see the errors because I still hit them all the time and we still need to know how we can go about solving them. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you got a lot out of this one. I realize what we covered is not great for everybody, but it is necessary to make this project happen. And that's just really what it's all about here. So I want to help you make your projects happen because I remember what it's like. I remember struggling through all of those things and then really feeling like I'm not going to get through it. And then right when I felt that way, I just always kind of got over it. And that's why I'm here. I want to help you just get over that last hump of some of the challenges you are facing with your projects. So if you are facing any of those challenges, let me know in the comments below because either myself or someone on the Linode support team will help reach out to you to get those things done. And of course, if you did like this, it helps me a lot if you subscribe and actually thumbs up this video and maybe even share it to a friend or whatever you want to do. But the idea is the more we hear from you guys, the more you interact with this, the more videos we can produce together. So thanks again for watching and I'll see you next time.